The atmosphere was tense, as everyone understood that the upcoming battle would be the most serious threat the base had faced since its establishment. General Morrison began the briefing by outlining the intelligence reports. The Taliban had been massing fighters in the mountains surrounding the base, bringing in weapons and supplies for what appeared to be a sustained assault. Intercepted communications suggested that they intended to target the medical facilities specifically, understanding that disrupting the base's ability to treat wounded soldiers would create chaos and demoralize the defenders. "Gentlemen and ladies," the general said, nodding toward Major Wells, "we are facing a significant threat. The enemy knows that our medical capabilities are crucial to our operations, and they intend to eliminate those capabilities early in their attack. We need to ensure that our medical personnel are protected and that our trauma treatment facilities remain operational under fire." Colonel Martinez raised concerns about the current medical staffing situation, pointing out that recent casualties and transfers had left the medical unit operating below optimal strength. He suggested that all available medical personnel should be activated for combat duty, given the anticipated casualty rates from the coming battle. Captain Williams saw this as an opportunity to address the Maria Santos situation without directly challenging the general's previous orders. "Sir, if we're going to face heavy casualties, we should consider utilizing all of our most experienced medical personnel. Staff Sergeant Santos has extensive trauma surgery experience and has proven herself in combat situations." The room fell silent. Everyone present knew about General Morrison's standing orders regarding female personnel in combat roles, and everyone also knew about Maria's exceptional medical skills. The request put the general in a difficult position: stick to his principles, and potentially compromise the medical care available to wounded soldiers, or make an exception that might undermine his authority and acknowledged policy. General Morrison's face reddened slightly, and his voice took on the edge that his officers had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Captain Williams, I believe I was very clear about my policies regarding female personnel in combat situations. Those policies have not changed, and they will not change regardless of the circumstances we face." Major Wells, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, spoke up from her position at the intelligence table. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence indicates that the medical facilities will be primary targets. If we're going to lose medical personnel to enemy action, shouldn't we start with our most expendable assets rather than keeping our best people in safe positions?"
The question was diplomatic but pointed, and everyone in the room understood its implications.
Major Wells was essentially arguing that if medical personnel were going to be at risk anyway, it made no sense to keep the most skilled medics away from the action while sending less experienced people into danger. General Morrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. His face was now noticeably flushed, and his voice carried barely controlled anger. "Major Wells, I am not going to debate military policy with my staff officers. My decisions are based on years of experience and proven military doctrine. Women do not belong in direct combat roles, period. They lack the physical strength, the emotional stability, and the mental toughness required for these situations." He began pacing behind his chair, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "I have seen what happens when emotional complications enter combat situations. I have seen male soldiers make bad decisions because they're trying to protect female colleagues. I have seen unit cohesion break down because of romantic entanglements and interpersonal drama. I will not allow those complications to compromise the safety of this base." Colonel Martinez attempted to redirect the conversation back to tactical considerations, but General Morrison was not finished. The stress of the impending battle, combined with what he perceived as challenges to his authority, had triggered a response that surprised everyone in the room with its intensity. "Let me tell you all something about Staff Sergeant Santos," the general continued, his voice growing louder. "I don't care how many lives she supposedly saved. I don't care what her performance reviews say. I don't care what any of you think about her qualifications. She is a woman, and women do not have what it takes to handle real combat medicine." The officers in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had all worked with Maria and knew that the general's characterization was not only unfair, but factually incorrect. However, military protocol demanded that they remain silent while their commanding officer spoke, regardless of their personal disagreements with his statements. General Morrison returned to his chair, but remained standing behind it, leaning forward with his hands gripping the back. "Santos will remain on administrative duty throughout this operation. She will process paperwork, maintain supply inventories, and handle communications. The real medical work will be done by soldiers who have the strength and courage required for combat operations." Captain Williams made one final attempt to present the medical unit's perspective. "Sir, I need to point out that our medical team is already understaffed for an operation of this magnitude. Every experienced medic could make the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. This comment seemed to push General Morrison beyond his limit of tolerance for dissent. He slammed his hand down on the table, causing papers to scatter and making everyone in the room jump. Captain Williams, are you questioning my judgment? Are you suggesting that I don't understand what's required to keep my soldiers alive? Your assessment is noted and rejected. Santos stays where she is, and I don't want to hear another word about it from anyone. The general's voice had risen to nearly a shout, and his face was now bright red. If any officer in this room has a problem with my decisions, they are welcome to request a transfer. Otherwise, you will follow orders without question or further discussion. The meeting continued for another hour, covering defensive positions, ammunition supplies, and coordination with air support, but the atmosphere remained tense after the general's outburst. Officers who had worked together effectively for months now found themselves walking on eggshells, afraid that any comment might trigger another explosion of anger from their commanding officer. After the meeting ended, several officers lingered in the hallway outside the command center, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Colonel Martinez expressed concern that General Morrison's personal issues with female soldiers were compromising operational effectiveness. Major Wells pointed out that keeping experienced medical personnel out of combat roles violated basic military common sense, regardless of gender considerations. Captain Williams was particularly troubled by the situation. As the officer responsible for medical operations, he understood better than anyone the potential consequences of operating with reduced medical capabilities during a major battle. He had seen the results of inadequate medical care in previous deployments, and he knew that soldiers would die unnecessarily if the medical team was not operating at full strength. Word of the general's comments during the meeting spread quickly through the base, as military bases are notorious for rapid information transmission despite official secrecy. Within hours, most of the enlisted personnel knew that General Morrison had specifically insulted Maria Santos and had made broad, derogatory comments about women in combat roles. The reaction among the soldiers was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Maria was universally respected among the enlisted ranks, and many soldiers owed their lives to her skill and dedication. Hearing that she was being deliberately excluded from the upcoming battle while being personally attacked by the commanding officer created anger and resentment that spread throughout the base. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had spoken with Maria before the Alpha Company mission, gathered several other senior enlisted personnel to discuss the situation. These were career soldiers with decades of combined experience, and they understood the military hierarchy as well as anyone. But they also understood that leadership failures could get soldiers killed, and they were beginning to view General Morrison's policies as exactly that kind of failure. Look, I've served under a lot of officers over the years, Rodriguez told the group. Some good, some bad, some indifferent. But I've never seen anything like this. We've got the best combat medic on the base sitting in an office filing papers while we're getting ready for the biggest fight we've ever faced. It's insane. Staff Sergeant Michael Johnson, a weapons specialist with 15 years of experience, nodded in agreement. Santos has saved more lives than any 3 other medics combined. I've seen her work under fire. I've seen her keep guys alive when everybody thought they were gone. Now we're supposed to go into battle without her because the general has issues with women? The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, with each participant sharing their experiences working with Maria and their concerns about the upcoming battle. These soldiers had been in combat before, and they understood that medical support could mean the difference between coming home alive and coming home in a body bag. They also understood that challenging a general's authority could end their military careers, but they were beginning to feel that some things were more important than career advancement. Meanwhile, Maria continued her administrative duties, unaware of the discussions taking place around the base. She had learned about General Morrison's comments during the staff meeting from Captain Williams, who felt obligated to inform her about the personal nature of the general's statements. The news was painful but not surprising, given the pattern of treatment she had experienced since the general's arrival. Maria had been raised in a military family and had always understood that military service required personal sacrifice. Her father had been a career soldier, and her older brother was currently serving in the Navy. She had been taught from childhood that duty came before personal feelings, and that soldiers must be prepared to subordinate their individual desires to the needs of their unit and their mission. But the current situation challenged these beliefs in ways that Maria had never anticipated. She was being asked to sacrifice not just her personal career advancement, but her ability to serve effectively and save lives. She was watching other soldiers prepare for a dangerous mission while being told that her gender made her unsuitable to help them, despite having more experience and better skills than many of the medics who would be treating casualties. The internal conflict was tearing at Maria's sense of identity and purpose. She had joined the military to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers. She had endured years of training, had proven herself in combat, and had dedicated herself completely to becoming the best medic possible. Now she was being told that none of that mattered because of her gender, and that her desire to serve was actually a liability that could endanger other soldiers. 2 days before the anticipated Taliban attack, the situation reached a breaking point in a way that nobody had expected. A routine patrol encountered a small group of Taliban fighters who had been conducting reconnaissance near the base perimeter. The firefight was brief but intense, resulting in 2 wounded American soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. The patrol called for medical evacuation, and the medical team prepared to receive the casualties. One soldier had taken a bullet through the shoulder that had damaged major blood vessels, and he was losing blood rapidly. The other had been injured by grenade shrapnel and had multiple wounds that required surgical treatment. Both soldiers needed the kind of advanced trauma care that Maria was uniquely qualified to provide. Dr. Hayes immediately requested that Maria be included in the trauma team, explaining to Captain Williams that these cases required the most experienced personnel available. Captain Williams understood the medical necessity, but was bound by General Morrison's explicit orders. He contacted the General's office to request permission for Maria to participate in the medical treatment. General Morrison's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, delivered the General's response within minutes. Staff Sergeant Santos was to remain on administrative duty, and the medical team would handle the casualties with currently authorized personnel. There would be no exceptions to this policy regardless of the circumstances. Dr. Hayes was incredulous. These soldiers could die without the best possible medical care. Santos has the most experience with these types of injuries. How can we justify not using our most skilled personnel? Captain Williams shared Dr. Hayes' frustration, but military hierarchy left no room for debate. Doctor, I understand your position, but the General's orders are clear. We work with the team we have. The medical team proceeded with the treatment using less experienced personnel, while Maria watched from her desk across the base. The soldier with the shoulder wound required vascular surgery that was at the edge of the available medic's skill level. The procedure took twice as long as it would have taken Maria, and the patient lost additional blood while the medic struggled with the delicate repair work. The second soldier's injuries were even more challenging. The shrapnel had caused internal damage that required precise surgical technique to repair without causing additional harm. The medic assigned to the case was competent but lacked Maria's experience with complex trauma surgery. What should have been a straightforward procedure became a lengthy ordeal that put additional stress on the patient's already compromised condition. Both soldiers survived, but their recovery was significantly complicated by the prolonged surgical procedures and additional blood loss. Dr. Hayes documented these complications in his medical report, noting that more experienced personnel might have achieved better outcomes. The report would eventually make its way up the chain of command, adding to the growing documentation of problems caused by General Morrison's policies. The soldiers at the base were well aware of what had happened. They knew that 2 of their fellow soldiers had received suboptimal medical care because the best medic was forbidden from treating them. The anger and resentment that had been building for weeks finally reached the point where some soldiers felt compelled to take action, despite the risks to their own careers. That evening, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He approached Maria at the base mess hall and asked to speak with her privately. The conversation took place outside the dining facility, under a clear desert sky filled with stars that seemed to mock the chaos and injustice unfolding below. Santos, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully, Rodriguez began. What happened today with those wounded soldiers, what's been happening with you over the past few weeks, it's not right. It's not military justice, and it's not protecting American soldiers. It's the opposite of everything we're supposed to stand for. Maria listened quietly as Rodriguez explained that he and several other senior enlisted personnel had been discussing the situation and had reached the conclusion that something needed to be done. They were prepared to take their concerns directly to higher command levels, bypassing General Morrison entirely, despite the potential consequences to their own careers. We can't stand by and watch good soldiers get hurt or killed because of one man's prejudices, Rodriguez continued. You're the best medic we've got, and keeping you away from wounded soldiers is criminal. We're going to do something about it, with or without your permission. Maria felt a mixture of gratitude and fear. She appreciated that her fellow soldiers were willing to risk their careers to support her, but she also understood the potential consequences of challenging military authority. Rodriguez, I appreciate what you're saying, but you could destroy your career. You could face court-martial? Is it really worth it? Rodriguez looked directly at her, his expression serious and determined. Santos, I've got 18 years in the army. I've served in Iraq twice and Afghanistan 3 times. I've seen good soldiers die because of bad leadership, and I've regretted every time I didn't speak up when I should have. I'm not going to make that mistake again. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Rodriguez explaining the plan that he and the other senior enlisted personnel had developed. They intended to file formal complaints through the military justice system, documenting General Morrison's discriminatory policies and their impact on operational effectiveness. They would request investigations by higher command levels and would be prepared to testify about specific incidents where soldiers had been endangered by the general's decisions. Maria understood that this action could change everything, but she also understood that it could destroy the careers of everyone involved. Military authorities took challenges to command structure very seriously, and soldiers who filed complaints against their commanding officers often found their careers effectively ended, even when their complaints were justified. As she walked back to her quarters that night, Maria found herself facing the most difficult decision of her military career. She could remain silent and accept the situation, protecting her fellow soldiers from the risks of challenging authority, or she could support their efforts to seek justice, knowing that the consequences could be severe for everyone involved. The next morning would bring new developments that would make the decision even more complicated, and the approaching Taliban attack would create circumstances that nobody had anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone's commitment to the values they claimed to uphold. And Maria Santos was about to discover that sometimes doing the right thing requires risking everything you have worked for. The Taliban attack began at dawn on October 3rd, just as intelligence reports had predicted. The first sign was the whistle of incoming mortars, followed by explosions that shook the entire base and sent soldiers scrambling for defensive positions. Within minutes, the attack escalated into the most intense battle that Forward Operating Base Phoenix had ever experienced. General Morrison had positioned himself in the command bunker, coordinating defensive operations and maintaining communication with other coalition forces in the region. The initial assault was even more fierce than intelligence estimates had suggested, with Taliban fighters attacking from multiple directions using coordinated small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortar barrages. The medical facility became a scene of controlled chaos as wounded soldiers began arriving within the first hour of the attack. Hayes and his reduced medical team worked frantically to stabilize casualties and prepare them for evacuation to larger medical facilities. The first wave of wounded included 6 soldiers with various injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to severe burns from an explosion near the motor pool. Maria Santos sat at her administrative desk in a separate building, listening to the radio chatter and the sounds of battle, while filing supply requisitions that suddenly seemed completely meaningless. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to join the medical team, to help save the lives of soldiers who were fighting and dying to protect the base. But General Morrison's orders were clear. She was to remain on administrative duty regardless of circumstances. The battle intensified throughout the morning, and casualties continued to mount. The medical team was quickly overwhelmed as more seriously wounded soldiers arrived. One soldier had lost his left arm to an RPG explosion and was going into shock from blood loss. Another had taken multiple shrapnel wounds to his abdomen and required immediate surgery to prevent internal bleeding from becoming fatal. Dr. Hayes sent urgent requests to the command bunker for additional medical personnel, specifically requesting that Staff Sergeant Santos be authorized to join the trauma team. The requests were relayed to General Morrison, who was coordinating defensive operations while monitoring casualty reports from his various unit commanders. The general's response came back through the chain of command within minutes. Staff Sergeant Santos was to remain at her assigned administrative post, and the medical team would handle casualties with currently authorized personnel. Even in the midst of the most serious battle the base had ever faced, General Morrison's policies regarding female personnel in combat roles would not be modified. As the morning progressed, the medical situation became increasingly desperate. The medical team was operating beyond their capacity, with less experienced medics struggling to handle complex trauma cases that would have been routine for Maria. Dr. Asatreb. Hayes watched in frustration as procedures took longer than necessary, as opportunities for optimal treatment were missed, and as wounded soldiers received care that was adequate but not as good as what they could have received. Meanwhile, the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Taliban fighters had managed to breach the outer defensive perimeter in 2 locations, and intense fighting was taking place inside the base compound. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was leading a squad defending the eastern approach when an RPG explosion knocked him unconscious and left him with severe head injuries. Rodriguez was evacuated to the medical facility, where Dr. Hayes quickly assessed his condition. The head injury was serious but not immediately life-threatening. But Rodriguez also had internal injuries from the blast that required surgical intervention. The medic assigned to Rodriguez's case was competent but lacked experience with the specific type of internal trauma that Rodriguez had sustained. As Rodriguez lay unconscious on the operating table, Maria could see the medical facility from her administrative post. She knew that Rodriguez was being treated by less experienced personnel, and she knew that his life might depend on surgical skills that she possessed but was forbidden from using. The irony was crushing. The soldier who had risked his career to defend her rights was now fighting for his life, while she was prevented from helping him. The battle continued to rage throughout the afternoon, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Taliban had committed more fighters to the attack than intelligence estimates had suggested, and they were fighting with a desperation that indicated they viewed this as a critical strategic objective. Coalition forces were holding their positions but taking significant casualties in the process. By late afternoon, the medical facility had treated more than 30 wounded soldiers, stretching the medical team far beyond their normal capacity. Several soldiers had died from wounds that might have been survivable with more experienced medical care, and Dr. Hayes was documenting these losses while continuing to treat incoming casualties. The situation reached a critical point when a massive explosion rocked the base, caused by a Taliban rocket that struck the ammunition storage area. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows throughout the base and sent debris flying for hundreds of yards. The explosion also started fires that spread rapidly through several buildings, creating additional casualties and threatening to overwhelm the firefighting capabilities. In the aftermath of the explosion, multiple soldiers were brought to the medical facility with severe burns and blast injuries. Among them was Captain Williams, Maria's direct supervisor, who had been knocked unconscious and suffered severe burns on his arms and chest. Also injured was Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, General Morrison's aide-de-camp, who had been thrown against a concrete wall by the blast and had sustained multiple fractures and possible internal injuries. Dr. Hayes looked at the influx of critically wounded soldiers and realized that his medical team was simply not capable of handling this many complex cases simultaneously. Some of the wounded soldiers would die without immediate treatment, but the medical team lacked the personnel to treat everyone at once. For the first time in his medical career, Dr. Hayes was faced with having to choose which soldiers would receive treatment and which would have to wait, knowing that waiting might mean death. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, despite his injuries, remained conscious and was trying to coordinate medical evacuation flights for the most serious cases. When he realized the severity of the medical personnel shortage, he made a decision that would change everything. Despite being General Morrison's closest aide and most loyal supporter, Stevens understood that soldiers were going to die unnecessarily if the medical situation was not addressed immediately. Stevens struggled to his feet despite Dr. Calabato, Hayes' protests about his injuries, and made his way to the communications equipment. He contacted the command bunker directly and requested to speak with General Morrison about the medical emergency. When the general came on the radio, Stevens delivered a report that was both professional and brutally honest. "Sir, we have multiple critical casualties who require immediate surgical intervention. The medical team is operating beyond capacity, and we are going to lose soldiers who could be saved if we had additional experienced medical personnel. I recommend that all available medical personnel be activated immediately, regardless of previous duty assignments." General Morrison's response was swift and angry. "Colonel Stevens, my orders regarding medical personnel assignments have not changed. The medical team will handle the situation with currently authorized personnel." Edge. Stevens, who had served as the general's loyal aide for 2 years and had never questioned his decisions, found himself in the position of having to choose between loyalty to his commander and responsibility to the wounded soldiers around him. Looking at Captain Williams, who was slipping in and out of consciousness from his burns, and at several other soldiers whose lives hung in the balance, Stevens made the decision that would define his military career. "Sir, with all due respect, Staff Sergeant Santos is the most experienced trauma surgeon we have. Captain Williams is critically injured, and we have multiple soldiers who need surgical intervention that our current medical team is not equipped to handle. I am requesting permission to activate Santos for medical duty immediately." The radio crackled with static for several long seconds before General Morrison's voice came back, filled with barely controlled rage. "Colonel Stevens, you are out of line. Santos remains on administrative duty, and I will not discuss this further. Handle the medical situation with available personnel, and that is a direct order." Stevens looked around the medical facility, at the wounded soldiers, at the overwhelmed medical team, and at the chaos that surrounded him. In that moment, he understood that following orders blindly could result in the deaths of soldiers who could be saved. He also understood that what he was about to do would probably end his military career, But he had reached the point where he could no longer prioritize his career over the lives of his fellow soldiers. "Dr. Hayes," Stevens called across the medical facility, "activate Staff Sergeant Santos for emergency medical duty. Get her over here immediately." "Doctor," Hayes looked at Stevens with surprise and concern. "Sir, General Morrison has specifically ordered that Santos remain on administrative duty. I can't countermand his direct orders without proper authorization." Stevens, despite his injuries and the pain he was experiencing, drew himself up to his full height and spoke with all the authority his rank carried. "Doctor, I am the senior officer present at this medical facility, and I am giving you a direct order. Activate Staff Sergeant Santos for medical duty immediately. I will take full responsibility for this decision." The medical facility fell silent, except for the moans of wounded soldiers and the distant sounds of battle. Everyone present understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens had directly countermanded General Morrison's orders, risking court-martial and the end of his career to ensure that wounded soldiers received the best possible medical care. Dr. Hayes hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the communications equipment. He contacted Maria's administrative post and ordered her to report to the medical facility immediately for emergency medical duty. Maria received the order with a mixture of relief and apprehension, understanding that someone had taken enormous personal risks to make this possible. When Maria arrived at the medical facility, the scene was unlike anything she had experienced in her 8 months of deployment. Wounded soldiers covered every available surface, medical personnel were working frantically to stabilize critical cases, and the air was filled with the urgency that comes when lives hang in the balance. But this was exactly the environment where Maria's skills and experience could make the greatest difference. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, despite his own injuries, briefed Maria on the most critical cases and told her to take charge of the surgical procedures that required the most experience. "Santos, I need you to save as many of these soldiers as possible. Do whatever it takes, use whatever resources you need, and don't worry about anything except keeping these men alive." Maria immediately assessed the wounded soldiers and identified the cases that required immediate surgical intervention. Captain Williams was her first priority, as his burns were severe and he was showing signs of respiratory distress that could become fatal within minutes. She worked with swift efficiency, drawing on years of training and months of combat experience to stabilize his condition and begin the treatment that would save his life. Over the next 6 hours, Maria performed surgical procedures on 12 different soldiers, including several operations that were at the absolute edge of battlefield medical capability. She repaired damaged arteries, removed shrapnel from vital organs, stabilized fractures, and treated burns with a skill and speed that impressed even Dr. Hayes, who had been practicing medicine for more than 20 years. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had been unconscious since his injury, underwent surgery to repair internal damage caused by the RPG blast. Maria's experience with this type of trauma allowed her to complete the procedure in half the time that would have taken less experienced personnel, and her surgical technique minimized additional trauma that could have complicated Rodriguez's recovery. As Maria worked, word of what had happened spread throughout the base. Soldiers learned that Lieutenant Colonel Stevens had defied General Morrison's direct orders to activate Maria for medical duty, and that Maria was now treating the most critically wounded soldiers with the skill and dedication that everyone knew she possessed. The reaction among the enlisted personnel was overwhelmingly positive, as they saw this as justice finally being served and wounded soldiers receiving the care they deserved. But in the command bunker, General Morrison was experiencing a level of anger that his staff had never seen before. When he learned that his direct orders had been countermanded and that Stevens had activated Maria for medical duty, his rage was so intense that several officers were concerned about his ability to continue commanding the battle effectively. General Morrison immediately ordered Stevens to be relieved of duty and placed under arrest for insubordination. But Stevens was too badly injured to be moved and was still directing medical evacuation flights for the wounded soldiers. The general then ordered that Maria be removed from medical duty immediately and returned to her administrative post, but this order was ignored by Dr. Breyer. Hayes, who stated that removing Maria while she was performing life-saving surgery would be tantamount to murdering the soldiers she was treating. The battle continued to rage outside, but inside the medical facility, Maria and the medical team were winning their own war against death and injury. By evening, they had stabilized all of the critical casualties and had prepared the most serious cases for evacuation to larger medical facilities. Several soldiers who would have died with less experienced medical care were now expected to make full recoveries. As the Taliban attack finally began to weaken and coalition forces started to regain control of the situation, the immediate medical crisis was resolved. But the confrontation between General Morrison and his subordinates was just beginning, and the consequences would extend far beyond Forward Operating Base Phoenix. That evening, as Maria finally took a break from surgery and stepped outside the medical facility, she was approached by dozens of soldiers who wanted to thank her for saving their friends and fellow unit members. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had regained consciousness after his surgery, managed to speak with her briefly despite his injuries. "Santos, I heard what happened today. Stevens risked everything to get you activated, and you saved a lot of lives that would have been lost otherwise. I want you to know that every soldier on this base knows what you did, and we won't forget it." Maria felt a mixture of pride and concern about what the future might bring. She had been able to do her job and save lives, which was all she had ever wanted. But she also knew that the events of this day had created a crisis in the command structure that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. The next morning brought news that would change everything. General Morrison's handling of the battle, and particularly his decisions regarding medical personnel, had been monitored by higher command levels who were concerned about the unusual casualty patterns and reports of command dysfunction. A team of investigators from the Pentagon was being dispatched to conduct a formal inquiry into the events at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, despite facing potential court-martial for insubordination, had documented his decision-making process and had prepared a detailed report explaining why he felt compelled to countermand General Morrison's orders. The report included testimonies from Dr. Hayes and other medical personnel about the impact of the General's policies on medical care quality and soldier survival rates. The investigation would eventually reveal the full extent of General Morrison's discriminatory policies and their impact on operational effectiveness. The investigators would interview dozens of soldiers, review medical records and casualty reports, and examine the command decisions that had led to the crisis. The outcome would surprise everyone involved and would become a landmark case in military justice, demonstrating that even the highest-ranking officers are accountable for decisions that endanger the lives of the soldiers under their command. Maria Santos, who had only wanted to serve her country and save lives, would find herself at the center of a transformation in military policy that would benefit female soldiers for generations to come. The story of what happened at Forward Operating Base Phoenix would be told and retold throughout the military, becoming an example of how courage, integrity, and dedication to duty can triumph over prejudice and injustice, even in the most challenging circumstances. And Maria Santos would be remembered not just as an exceptional medic, but as a soldier who proved that true strength comes from character and competence, not from gender or rank. In the scorching heat of a military base in Afghanistan, where dust clouds dance with helicopters and the sound of gunfire echoes through the mountains, nobody expected that a single moment would expose the true character of those who wear the uniform. What started as a routine day at Forward Operating Base Phoenix would become a story that traveled across continents, sparked debates in the highest offices of government, and reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful people forget the very values they swore to protect. This is not just another military story. This is about courage that comes not from rank or medals, but from the human heart. It's about a female medic who saved lives every day, a general who made a choice that shocked his own soldiers, and a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. What happened next didn't just stun everyone who witnessed it. It changed the course of military justice and became a beacon of hope for those who believe that doing the right thing still matters, even when the odds are stacked against you. The desert wind that day carried more than sand and dust. It carried the seeds of a story that would prove that sometimes the smallest voice can create the biggest change, and that real strength isn't measured by the stars on your collar, but by the integrity in your actions. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had always known that being a female medic in the Army would bring challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the morning of September 15th at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The sun was already blazing at 6 in the morning, casting long shadows across the medical tent where she was checking supplies for what promised to be another busy day. Maria had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, and in that time she had saved more lives than she could count. Her small hands, which her drill sergeant had once mocked during basic training, had become instruments of healing and hope. Soldiers twice her size would calm down just hearing her voice during the worst moments of their lives. She had pulled shrapnel from wounded bodies under enemy fire, performed emergency surgery in moving helicopters, and comforted dying soldiers by holding their hands and whispering words of comfort in their final moments. The base was home to nearly 3,000 soldiers, and Maria had earned respect from almost everyone. She never complained about working 18-hour shifts. She never showed fear when mortars fell close to the medical tent. She treated everyone equally, whether they were privates fresh from basic training or colonels with decades of experience. Her reputation for excellence had spread throughout the region, and other bases would specifically request her when they had critical cases. But respect from fellow soldiers was different from respect from the command structure, and Maria had learned this lesson the hard way over the months. General Robert Morrison had arrived at the base 3 weeks earlier, and from his first day, it was clear that he had very specific ideas about how women should function in his command. He was a career military man, 58 years old, with a chest full of medals and a reputation for running tight operations. He had served in Iraq twice and Afghanistan once before, always in leadership positions, always demanding absolute compliance with his vision of military discipline. Morrison came from what he called the old school of military thinking. He believed that combat zones were no place for women, that mixing genders in high-stress situations created unnecessary complications, and that certain jobs should remain exclusively male domains. He had been vocal about these opinions during military conferences, had written articles for military journals expressing these views, and had made it clear to his staff that he intended to run his base according to these principles. From the moment General Morrison took command, Maria noticed changes in how she was treated. Suddenly, she was being assigned to administrative duties instead of field medicine. Her requests for advanced medical training were denied without explanation. Other medics, male soldiers with less experience and lower performance reviews, were being chosen for important missions while she was left behind to organize supply closets and file paperwork. The other female soldiers on the base were experiencing similar treatment. Lieutenant Jennifer Park, an intelligence officer with a master's degree and 5 years of experience, found herself relegated to typing reports instead of analyzing crucial intelligence data. Sergeant Lisa Johnson, a communications specialist who had set up radio networks that had saved countless lives, was suddenly deemed unsuitable for forward deployment and spent her days maintaining equipment that rarely needed maintenance. Maria tried to address the situation through proper channels. She spoke with her direct supervisor, Captain Williams, who sympathized but explained that General Morrison's orders were not to be questioned. She filed a formal request for a meeting with the general to discuss her role, but the request was denied by his aide-de-camp, who explained that the general was too busy with strategic operations to meet with individual soldiers about personnel issues. The medical situation at the base was becoming increasingly difficult. With Maria and other experienced female medical personnel sidelined, the medical unit was operating with reduced capability, just as casualty rates were increasing. The Taliban had intensified their attacks in the region, and every day brought wounded soldiers who needed the best medical care available. Richard Hayes, the chief medical officer, had repeatedly requested that Maria be returned to full medical duties, but his requests were consistently denied. Other soldiers began to notice the changes and express their concerns privately. Corporal Mike Thompson, whom Maria had saved after an IED explosion 2 months earlier, couldn't understand why she was suddenly organizing inventory instead of saving lives. "That woman pulled me back from the edge of death," he told his fellow soldiers. "Now they have her counting bandages while better medics are out there. It doesn't make sense." The tension on the base was building, but everyone understood the military hierarchy. General Morrison was the commanding officer, and his decisions, regardless of how illogical they seemed to those lower in rank, were to be followed without question. Challenging a general's authority was career suicide, and everyone knew it. So the soldiers watched in frustration as one of their most capable medics was wasted on meaningless tasks while they faced increasing dangers with reduced medical support. Maria continued to perform her assigned duties with the same dedication she had always shown, but inside, she was struggling. She had joined the military to serve her country and save lives. She had endured years of training, had proven herself in the most challenging situations, and had earned the respect of her peers through competence and bravery. Being reduced to a clerk felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for and sacrificed to achieve. The situation came to a head on the morning when Alpha Company was preparing for a high-risk mission to clear suspected Taliban positions in a nearby village. Intelligence suggested that the enemy was heavily armed and prepared for a fight. The mission would require the best medical support available, as casualties were expected to be high. Dr. Hayes had specifically requested that Maria be included in the medical team for the mission, given her experience with trauma surgery and her proven ability to work under fire. Captain Williams brought the request to General Morrison's morning briefing, explaining the medical unit's reasoning and the critical nature of the mission. The general listened without comment, his face showing no emotion as the captain detailed Maria's qualifications and the urgent need for her skills. When Captain Williams finished his presentation, the room fell silent, waiting for the general's response. General Morrison stood up from his desk, walked to the window overlooking the base, and spoke without turning around. His voice was calm but carried an edge that everyone in the room recognized as dangerous. "Captain Williams, I want to make something very clear to you and everyone else in this command. I don't care what this medic has done before. I don't care what her qualifications are. I don't care what the medical unit thinks they need. He turned back to face the room, his eyes cold and focused. Women do not belong in combat situations. They are a distraction to the male soldiers. They create emotional complications that can get people killed. They are physically weaker and cannot be relied upon when the situation becomes desperate. Staff Sergeant Santos will remain on administrative duty, and I don't want to hear another request to change that assignment. Captain Williams tried to respond, explaining the critical medical shortage and the specific skills that Maria brought to the team, but General Morrison cut him off with a wave of his hand. This discussion is over, Captain. You have your orders. See that they are followed. The other officers in the room exchanged glances but said nothing. They had all worked with Maria and knew her capabilities, but challenging the general's direct order was not something any of them were prepared to do. Captain Williams left the briefing with orders to inform Maria that she would not be participating in the mission and that any further requests for her inclusion in combat operations would be denied. When Maria received the news, she felt a mix of anger and disappointment that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. She had been preparing for this mission for days, studying the medical challenges they might face, coordinating with other medics, and ensuring that all necessary supplies would be available. Now she would watch from the base as other soldiers risked their lives with reduced medical support. That afternoon, as Alpha Company prepared to depart, Maria stood near the medical tent and watched the soldiers loading into their vehicles. She knew many of these men personally. She had treated their injuries, listened to their fears, and shared their hopes of returning home safely. Now she was forbidden from doing the job she was trained for, the job that might save their lives if things went wrong. Sergeant First Class David Rodriguez, the squad leader of one of the units going on the mission, approached Maria before departure. Rodriguez was a veteran with 12 years of service who had worked with Maria on numerous occasions. He looked uncomfortable as he spoke to her. Santos, I want you to know that none of us understand this decision. We all know you're the best combat medic we've got, and we all know we're going out there with less than our best medical support because of politics. He paused, looking around to make sure no officers were within earshot. If I had my way, you'd be coming with us. Hell, if any of us had our way, you'd be coming with us. Maria appreciated Rodriguez's words, but they also made the situation more painful. She thanked him and wished him luck, watching as the convoy pulled out of the base and disappeared into the desert landscape. For the next 6 hours, she sat in the medical tent, monitoring radio communications and preparing for casualties that she hoped wouldn't come, but expected would. The mission went as badly as everyone had feared. Alpha Company encountered heavy resistance, and within 2 hours of reaching the target area, they were calling for medical evacuation. 3 soldiers were critically wounded, and the medic with the unit was overwhelmed. Radio chatter indicated that one soldier was bleeding heavily from a leg wound that required immediate surgical intervention. Another had taken shrapnel to the chest and was having trouble breathing, and a third had been knocked unconscious by an explosion and was showing signs of severe head trauma. Dr. Hayes immediately began preparing the medical team for incoming casualties, and his first instinct was to include Maria in the trauma team. Her experience with battlefield injuries and her steady hands in crisis situations made her the obvious choice for the most critical cases. But when he called for her to join the team, Captain Williams reminded him of General Morrison's standing orders. Sir, the general was very specific. Santos is not to be involved in any combat-related medical operations, Captain Williams said, his own frustration evident in his voice. Dr. Hayes stared at him in disbelief. Captain, we have multiple critical casualties incoming. Santos has more experience with these types of injuries than any other medic on this base. Lives are at stake here. I understand that, sir, but I have direct orders from General Morrison. Santos remains on administrative duty. The helicopter carrying the wounded soldiers landed 20 minutes later, and the medical team rushed to receive them. Maria watched from across the base as stretchers were carried into the medical facility, knowing that she should be part of the team trying to save these lives, but forbidden from helping by a general who cared more about his personal prejudices than the welfare of his soldiers. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize the wounded soldiers, but they were operating short-handed and with less experienced personnel than optimal. One of the medics assisting with the chest wound victim was struggling with a procedure that Maria could have completed in half the time. Another medic was having difficulty controlling the bleeding from the leg wound, using techniques that Maria knew were less effective than newer methods she had mastered. As the hours passed and the medical team continued their work, Word spread throughout the base about what had happened. Soldiers who had served with Maria began talking among themselves about the situation. The wounded soldiers were their friends and fellow unit members, and everyone knew that the best possible medical care should be provided without regard to politics or personal prejudices. Later that evening, after the wounded soldiers had been stabilized and prepared for transport to a larger medical facility, Dr. Hayes submitted his report on the incident. In the report, he documented the medical challenges faced by his team and noted that the outcome might have been different if more experienced personnel had been available. He stopped short of directly criticizing General Morrison's orders, but his meaning was clear to anyone who read the report carefully. The report made its way up the chain of command, where it was read by officers who understood both the medical realities of combat operations and the political complexities of military leadership. Some of these officers had their own concerns about General Morrison's policies, but like everyone else in the military hierarchy, they were reluctant to challenge a general's authority without compelling reasons. Meanwhile, Maria continued her administrative duties, filing reports and organizing supplies, while knowing that her skills were desperately needed elsewhere. The frustration was eating away at her, but she maintained her professional demeanor and continued to perform her assigned tasks with the same dedication she had always shown. She had been raised to believe that service meant sacrifice, and she was prepared to sacrifice her own career advancement for the greater good. But watching wounded soldiers receive suboptimal care because of prejudice and politics was a different kind of sacrifice, one that challenged her core beliefs about duty and honor. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone's commitment to the values they claimed to uphold, and Maria Santos, despite being relegated to administrative duties, was about to find herself at the center of a storm that would change everything. 3 days after the Alpha Company incident, the situation at Forward Operating Base Phoenix took a dramatic turn that nobody could have predicted. Intelligence reports indicated that a major Taliban offensive was being planned for the following week, targeting multiple coalition bases in the region. General Morrison called an emergency meeting of all senior staff to discuss defensive preparations and coordinate with other military units in the area. The meeting took place in the base's main command center, a fortified building that served as the nerve center for all operations. Present were Colonel James Martinez, the deputy commander, Major Patricia Wells, the intelligence officer, Captain Williams from the medical unit, and several other department heads. General officer fired at the female medic. What happened next stunned everyone.